Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. I'm your host, Dean Jones. This is Season 12, Episode 17. Today, I'm very, very honored to be talking with authors Michelle Auerbach and Nicole Civita, who are the authors of the wonderful Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, Resetting Our Future. Michelle Auerbach holds an MFA in prose writing from Naropa University and is completing her PhD in Transformational Leadership with her dissertation on story as a technology for trauma-aware change for individuals, organizations, and communities. She has published 2 novels, The Third Kind of Horse, about life during AIDS crisis in New York City in the 1980s, and Alice Modern, which deals with Nazi-era Vienna and the desire to break free of old worlds that no longer serve. Her first nonfiction book is Resilience, the life-saving skill of story. She writes for the New York Times, the London Guardian, and Sunset Magazine. Her co-author, Nicole Civita, is a human mother, partner, and friend who is preoccupied with the possible and works like hell to bring its most beautiful bits into being. She is a shapeshifter who has, over the course of her career, taken on the form of an educator, pracademic, ethicist, attorney, administrator, mentor, author, advocate, and consultant. Often, though not always, she's focused her work on shaping change in through the food system. Nicole's efforts propelled multi-year projects to drastically reduce food waste, revitalize regional food systems, seek justice for agricultural and food workers, explore ethical dilemmas across the food chain, and develop systems-aware equity-enhancing laws and policies. A commitment to inform change-oriented interdisciplinary interrogation of practices, policies, preferences, and values that shape food systems propels Nicole's research. Within the sphere of agri-food studies, many experts urge examination of the food system from farm to fork. Nicole has always preferred to think about the food system from ecosystem through farm to community. Even more conceptually, she imagines a path guided by ethics and leads to relationship. I look forward to having you hear my conversation with Michelle and Nicole. I'm taking you to it now. Welcome to the Well-Seasoned Librarian podcast. Today I'm talking with Michelle Auerbach and Nicole Civita, who are authors of Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, Resetting Our Future. Michelle and Nicole, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Dean.
Thank you for having us.
So nice to be here.
Now, I want to ask you both, how did you guys meet? How did you start working on the book?
So this is go ahead. You start, I'll finish.
I was going to say, because it's a little like I can be self-deprecating and a little embarrassing about this. So we met at an event that's very much unlike the book. We met at something called Boulder Startup Week, which is really it's what it sounds. It's a week-long conference designed to support founders and startups. And I was supposed to be there to represent the organization I was working for, and I was looking at a lot of the panels and sessions being offered, and not many of them appealed to me, except for one that was on story as a really potent and powerful change strategy. So I definitely made sure I got into that one. And I sat in the audience just listening to every word Michelle had to say and thinking like, I need to get to know this woman. So I did the really embarrassing sort of typical thing of like pulling out my business card and, standing in the crowd of people around her at the end of the session, and just kind of trying to get her attention, and invited her to go get a cup of coffee and see if we could connect our work up. And Michelle did something different than anyone else has ever done in that setting. Something different that feels like it's so tied to the theory behind this book. So Michelle, you want to take over?
Sure. So I said, I make better coffee. Why don't you come to my house? Which is a weird offer to somebody who you only know teaches at the same university as you. So that was kind of weird. But what ended up happening was we immediately saw the connection between what we did, and Nicole had the idea, you should be coming and talking to my students so that what I teach them can be put through this idea of story as a change tool, and that their projects that they do with me will be stronger. And so I came into her class and we did that. And from that moment on, it really was the kind of relationship that we write about in the book, which is that we couldn't do it without each other. that we each really love and respect the things the other person does, that they're not the same. We don't look at things the same way, talk the same way about things, use even the same language. Our academic training is so different. And so when you read the book, what you get is Nicole and Michelle coming together with like all this deep respect and the knowledge that we need each other. And then we end up writing this book that sounds like neither of us. So it to us, it was the paradigm around which the book was built.
I really like that. All right, so I wanted to kind of lead into the book with a question, because I think this is kind of something that comes up in the book. Most of us go shopping at the local supermarkets for all the food we eat, and we depend on this somewhat dogmatically. We just assume it's going to always be there. Do you think we can keep depending on these food systems to sustain us?
So it's a really great question. And I think to like help people not kind of feel panicked about things, I think the answer is yes for a while, but not forever. And that we need to get really curious about at what cost, right? So it's, when I talk about things like the challenges and the harms that the food systems that we participate in cause, when I study that, when I talk about the fact that like there's a lot going on in terms of climate crisis and water quality and air quality and impacts on land and on humans and biodiversity loss and all of that, it starts to stack up in a way that feels really scary. It can feel really scary. And we're already experiencing these disruptions, right? We've already seen what happens when just-in-time supply chains don't serve us particularly well in a moment when everybody suddenly needs dry goods, or what happens when multiple bread baskets experience real climate and weather-related disruptions at once. I'm sitting here in Vermont where, many of our farms flooded this year, and we're seeing 30% losses, 40% losses on many of our farms. That will have an impact, maybe not on global supply chains, but certainly on the local food that many of us here treasure so much. So we're already experiencing disruption. We're in for more of it. And it becomes an invitation to sort of be curious about the places that our food comes from and comes through and where we go get it, and thinking about how we can diversify those strategies. So when I step into a supermarket, I see a lot of things I need, and I shop at the supermarket. Everybody else, I'm not, I'm growing some of my own food, I'm buying some of it locally, but there are plenty of regular trips. I see a system that is producing, yes, some of what we absolutely need, and then manufacturing a lot of wants and desires and conveniences that come at a great cost. And I don't think we'll be able to rely on that for a long time.
And can I add something to that?
Please.
Which is that, in one of the things we talk about in the book is that this falling apart of the system that we are used to is a scary thing, but it's also an opportunity for us to find joy and pleasure in other ways. So, I get I get to go down the street. I live in Colorado. I get to go down the street to the local farm and get stuff because I'm a CSA member. And like, there's so much joy in that. And during COVID, when people were having trouble accessing things, because we had supported this farmer for years and years, right? And this farmer created this community, we did not have problems in that little corner of the world. Farmers were still farming and the produce was still showing up, at the farm. And we got to go and like touch the produce, and it was a touchstone of like reality during COVID for me to be there. So I think that there's ways in which the things we do to find pleasure and connection now are going to last a lot longer than the systems that they're outside of, if that makes sense.
Most of us don't know much about the term agro-industrial complex and what this means. Can we talk a little bit about that and what it might mean for our listeners?
Yeah, let's do that, because I think there's a lot of work that has been done through, whether it's sort of like Madison Avenue marketing or classic American kind of myth making and storytelling around where food comes from. And it's a really great story, right? It's a story that like we tell our children when we sing them Old MacDonald Had a Farm and, you know, The Farmer in the Dell and all of these other things that like become a part of our consciousness. And even myself, when I first kind of made the pivot towards agriculture and food policy and food systems work, I had this idea that like farming was working in nature, was working with nature. And that's why I wanted to be a part of it. It just felt so darn wholesome. And unfortunately, like it is and it can be. And there are many places that still are, many forms of farming, those that we want to see people move to, that can absolutely be like that. But unfortunately, in the modern era, in our contemporary era, and now for many, many decades, that's not what farming has been like. It has been subjected to the same sort of industrial and extractive logics and pressures that many other aspects of society and the economy, many other sectors have. So, you know, we don't really often get our food from farms that like have the chickens mingling with the pigs and the nice kind of diversified garden. Peter Rabbit has not like got a whole smorgasbord of food to chew up and everything. Like these are really, really industrial, what we call monocultures, right? One plant being grown across thousands and thousands of acres, many animals being kind of stocked into a concrete feedlot. And there are better and worse versions of these around the edges, right? Ones where the welfare is a little bit better or where we don't spray certain kinds of synthetic pesticides. But all in all, it's a system that has been designed to create efficiency, to promote yield, and to generate profit. It's a system also that has been, it's a set of priorities around standardization so that things can be basically like all of the things that come out of the earth can kind of be turned into widgets and worked with and manufactured. And the purpose of all that, you know, ostensibly is to feed the world, right? If we do this really efficiently, we can keep feeding a growing population. And that sounds at first like a really, really noble, good idea, right? We want everyone to be well fed. But what we find when we look a lot closer, and of course, this is the journey I've taken students on for years, is that we're not actually feeding the world, but we are making a lot of profit for the companies that purport to do so. And so we wind up in a situation where, depending on the year, just shy of 1 billion people on this planet don't have enough to eat, don't have the right foods, and more of us are experiencing a lot of diet-related health implications and diseases. And yet we're producing so much food at such great cost. And so those are really the kind of machinations of the agro-industrial complex at work.
I'm reminded of the Irish potato famine when so many Irish people starved when the potato crops were dying, but still they were still producing food at the same time that was going over to England and while people were starving. Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yes.
That is exactly what we're talking about. And it's a good example because it was such a contained little system, right? It was a very small food system, but it demonstrates a lot of the same logics that we see now in the larger system that we're all part of, which is that often people are not growing for themselves. They're growing for some external group of people somewhere else, and they're not growing the things they need to survive. And so while there's agriculture going on everywhere, people aren't necessarily eating what they grow. And so that's a really good example. And you know, the modern day version of that might be that the people that work at the Tyson chicken plant actually need to go to the food bank that Tyson donates to get food because their wages do not allow them to eat sufficiently, you know, for their work and for their lives. And so they're shipping all their labor off somewhere else, getting food bank food, which Tyson's donating, but not paying them enough, right? So I would say that's our modern day version of the potato famine.
Oh my God. Now let's talk about the word food system. Can we talk about that a little bit and what it means exactly?
Sure. Yeah. So we have a handy dandy definition, and then we're going to tell you why it doesn't even matter. So The definition is the system is defined as an interconnected set of elements that is coherently organized in a way that achieves something. So we define a food system as an interconnected web of people, coexistent species, resources, and activities that extend across all domains involved in providing human nourishment, supporting vitality, and expressing the consumable, edible culture. So the when you study this stuff, and Nicole's the expert, so I think I'm actually the right person to answer this question. Because if you were an average person reading this book, you do not have, in fact, 10 years of working in this and 2 degrees and the whole thing, right? So what's a food system? It is enormous and too big for us to comprehend. And yet, if we take it down to a level where we can understand it, it's really how we each get our food and the web of life that entails around us. I think when you study it academically, you get offered all these like charts. There's like big charts, bigger charts, ocean, land, you know, and like there's just charts and charts and charts of the food system. And what you realize is, oh, nobody has a grasp on it, which is, I think, for us, a really important message. It's so big you can't grasp it. Chances are, number one, it isn't going to support you, and number two, you can't change it. So we need to start looking at that second definition of the things that bring us vitality and life and bring life to the world around us. So oddly, part of my food system is the spruce tree in my front yard, right? Because I actually make spruce syrup every year from the spruce tips from the spruce tree so that I can put it in my coffee, right? So that's understandable. I water the tree, I get the spruce tips, we make some simple syrup. But when you start to enlarge it and enlarge it and enlarge it, it gets to the point where it's so big that it's actually hard for people to work with. And so our suggestion is like, yes, there's a chapter in the book that describes everything that system does and all of the harms it creates and all of the ways that it functions. And then there's, 5 other chapters that talk about other things. So I think it's important to understand that how we choose to connect with people, species, plants, our environment, our nourishment, our body, that's the system we can work with.
Now, we discussed in the book how the global food system is sick. Can we talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think that the sickness really, it's directly related to that kind of agro-industrial, transactional, extractive orientation of the global food system and the food systems within it. I think Michelle did a really nice job of talking about like how the food system as a monolithic concept is really hard to grasp, is really big, right? It contains a lot of stuff that's kind of spans the world. A way I think about it is that it's also a nested and interconnected set of systems, right? Not quite like Russian nesting dolls in that like they're not all fit inside each other, but we all participate in lots of food systems. But we often talk about it. And if you happen to hear, policy talk right now, a lot of it about the US Farm Bill, for example, we're talking about it like there's one big system. And it's that big system, that agro-industrial complex, that is causing the most harm. It's causing harm basically in the act of trying to feed the world. What we're doing is degrading the planet's capacity to keep supporting life. And that includes our lives, but also the lives of the plants, the animals, the fungi, the microorganisms that we rely on for nourishment. And so it's we could take this kind of back down to a level that I think is really familiar and cognizable even by young children, right? Like when I would go into my kids' kindergarten or preschool, we would talk about food webs, right? And used to call them food chains, maybe when many of us were in school, but just the idea that like each species is reliant upon other species in the ecosystem. And there has to be some degree of balance there. There has to be some degree of reciprocity, of nutrients moving through food systems and even coming out, right, like as wastes, as excrements, and then being brought back into the system. It's actually like this, the parts we don't like to think about. We love to think about food and how delicious it is and all of the beautiful things we can do with it. We like to think less about the parts that like we don't necessarily savor and we get rid of. But there's this beautiful sort of dance between what we consume and what we excrete that makes for really, really healthy soil. Right. And that's when I say we, I mean all of the creatures involved in food systems and food webs. And we've kind of broken up those relationships. Right. So when I talked about the agro-industrial complex and the simplification, when you're growing crops without animals, for example, the plants are taking up lots of nutrients and they're not necessarily being put back into the soil, right? And so we're degrading our soils and their biological diversity within them. We're farming in ways using really, really heavy machinery that's fossil fuel dependent, that's compacting that soil. We're putting lots and lots and lots of synthetic fertilizers because we don't have animals refertilizing the land on that same cropland. We're putting all of that on and putting it on in ways that are just different than what animal manures or plant manures, green manures would be like. And they're fugitive. The rain falls and they kind of run off into the watershed and disrupt the balance of compounds and elements going on in that watershed. And they cause too much algae to bloom, which in turn means there's not enough water, oxygen in the water for aquatic species. And then marine ecosystems collapse. Now I could do this like all day with these examples, right? Showing how basically the way we're farming and the scale that we're farming at is actually disrupting Earth systems. And the one we talk about most these days, because it's finally getting enough attention, is the disruption of the climate system and the atmosphere. And food systems are responsible for anywhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of global greenhouse gas emissions. So the ways, again, that we're going about producing and moving all this food around really, really matters to the future of life on Earth. But that's the agro-industrial version of it. And that doesn't have to be, those don't have to be foregone conclusions. It's a lot about the how, not just the need to feed ourselves as humans.
So one of the things that's intriguing to me in the book is the idea that we're trying to feed the world. That's something that many companies say, like Nestle, for instance, would be one that was saying they're trying to feed the world, but also they're taking from the environments too. Like they're taking water and providing it to other people. And it just depends on who pays top dollar. Can we talk about this a little bit and how this works into this idea?
About the feeding the world part?
Yeah, like many companies, like they're, I mean, I don't want to name too many names, but like, many companies, their whole thing is they'll even have logos that kind of show them as like being this nurturing presence, but then they're taking like water, like in California, for instance, Nestle takes tons of water from our aquifers for their own usages and then sells it back to us. Basically, I think it's the idea like somebody stealing your hat and selling it back to you, and it's just like,
Yeah.
and so we see that a lot. Like in California, we have a lot of mono cultures where we just grow one type of crop. Like if you go down to Northern California, you could just see almonds, 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 and that's all we're
Right.
growing. And a lot of the water comes from the local aquifers to all this almonds that are being sold around the world. So it's like we're robbing Peter to pay Paul, basically.
Yes. And I'm going to answer that slightly a different way, which is you just described kind of the checklist of things to look for, not to engage in. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So like we talk
Yeah.
about a relational approach to food systems versus a transactional approach to food systems. And there's even a little chart in the back of the book that says this is relational, this is transactional. But what you just described is like, how do I know it's transactional? They have a thing on the label that says they're feeding the world. They're making money off of a resource that's available in my backyard, right? They're selling something in huge quantities from a place to places all over the world and not considering the needs of the place they're growing, right? So, but the relational approach would be, a very different way to go about the same thing. And we can look at like that checklist is they're engaging with the people around them. They're looking at the needs of the communities they're in. They're making coalitions. They're not trying to provide things that go for top dollar necessarily, but like for top vitality for themselves, for the system, and for the other people. And I just have a lot of red flags that I go, oh, there we go, transactional, such as that label, we're feeding the world, or, when I see like people in lab coats walking through a field in a commercial, I immediately am like, no, there's something going on here, right? That's totally transactional. But if the goal in the end is to make money for shareholders and not to actually take care of people and the world that we live in and the ground that we walk on, it's going to be a transactional system like you're describing. So where does that leave almond milk? That leaves almond milk as something that you don't get to have all the time necessarily, if we're going to create a less transactional system. But pinyon pine milk in Colorado and New Mexico is awesome, right? And the trees are growing the pinyon pine, little pine nuts is what we call them, but the little pinyon pine seeds, like, that's great for me. So I've made pinyon pine milk, right? And I think that that's very relational. I get to know the person whose tree I'm stealing it from. I knock on the door, right? We talk to each other. I say, I'm taking the things off your tree. They say, awesome, can I taste them, right? And so where in some places hazelnuts grow and in some places walnuts grow, and in some places almonds grow, we can do the same things in much more relational ways. And so for me, those are just the like tick list of transactional food systems I prefer to avoid. Nobody can be perfect. As Nicole said, we both shop in grocery stores, but if I can avoid it, I will, and I'll try something different and see where the pleasure and the joy is in making something up for myself. So that's my response to when I hear we're feeding the world. I just immediately think, not for me.
So one of the things that Donella Meadows says, and she's a systems theorist and writer, she was, who, has informed my thinking and that we rely on a lot in the book. She says that if you want to really understand the goal of a system, don't ask the actors in the system what their goal is, look at their behavior. And so any company that says they're feeding the world, but isn't entirely focused on making sure that like their number one priority is getting food where it is most needed and doing so with the least harm, isn't actually trying to do that unless their behavior shows it. The behavior of many of the multinational companies that are the biggest movers and shakers and drivers in the global food system is in fact to make profit. And so, it is and can be very profitable to grow mass quantities of almonds in a place that has the right climate for it, unless and until the water is gone. But if your goal is profit making, then what you're going to do is not really care about using up all of that water for the future, near or far. You're going to care about how much profit you can make by using that land and by using that water and what you can turn it into and how you can get more people around the world interested in consuming that product and paying for it and making it, seem as though it's a really essential product. When we talk about the alternative, it's actually looking at what a supporting ecosystem that you're in bears, what it can continue to provide, and how you can participate in it. But as Michelle said, that doesn't have to be an arrangement of deprivation. It can absolutely be a journey of real discovery into understanding like what your place is willing to provide, and then what it maybe provides in natural profusion, in natural excess, that you can then trade with others to have tastes of their place. But that would mean probably a whole lot less trade, and only of the things that truly come into us in abundance.
You have several stories in the book about people who are making changes in the food systems. Can we talk about some of these stories?
Sure. The perfect one to talk about with this is the coffee ride. So one of the people we talk about, and we just keep finding out new cool things about this company that we didn't know. So I'm going to say some things that aren't in the book, but coffee is one of those things that is grown in a very specific climate, and that climate is rapidly changing. And one of the things that got us interested, I've always been a customer of the Coffee Ride. And the Coffee Ride is a small coffee company here in Colorado. And the owner, Josh Crane, um, sources coffee very, very responsibly. There's like so much going on with coffee. There's like, it's in the book, all the details, but he sources it incredibly responsibly, roasts it in it, and then delivers it to you by bike. And he started this whole company as like a way to create more relationships with the people he worked with when he worked in a bike shop, and was bringing coffee in to them and trying to like, bring people together. So that's kind of cool. But one of the things that we asked Josh in the process of writing the book was like, what's going to happen when the climate changes enough that like coffee doesn't grow where it's supposed to? And we were afraid he was going to like to describe some science fiction dystopia where people don't drink coffee. And he said, no. Certain kinds of beans will continue to grow, and they are much more flexible kinds of coffee, and it's just going to get moved around. But the really fancy stuff that is like very specific to a certain ecosystem isn't going to exist. But he said it in this very reassuring way. And I think that's because his whole job is to like find and support the coffee growers who are growing coffee in ways that are going to continue to exist, to show people what it would mean to have a relationship with the person that they're getting, even a good like that doesn't grow in their growing region, and then to also make sure it tastes really awesome. It's really good coffee. And so he's providing a service in an area, right? He's not trying to provide coffee to the whole world. He's providing coffee to a large section of Colorado, which is not like super densely populated state, right? So it's it's a fascinating business concept. And I can sit on my front porch and Josh shows up on his bike and throws me a bag of coffee like an old school newspaper boy would throw you your newspaper. And I get so much joy from being like, hey, Josh, as I get my coffee. But he's also growing his business. He's just added 6 new employees. They opened a cafe so you can go get your coffee as opposed to having to bring it to you. You can, have him make you a cup of coffee. He works with a lot of local CSAs to distribute the coffee that way. And so it's not like he's doing some like niche thing that isn't working. He's like growing a very robust business, supporting himself and his 6 employees, and also doing it in a way that harms the environment the least, harms the people who he's getting the coffee from the least, supports people who he will buy from a woman-owned Guatemalan coffee growing cooperative, even though it's more expensive, and he can only still charge the same thing basically for the coffee because you can only charge what you can charge. So he's doing a lot of the things that we talk about as relational moves and succeeding at it.
And I think when Michelle says he's growing, one of the things that we critique a lot in the book is the idea of growth for the sake of growth, or endless growth, right? As an economic paradigm, there is that concept of infinite economic growth on a finite planet, and a kind of closed planetary system doesn't make any sense. But it's a really important thing to note that we're not like against all growth, right? There is an amount of healthy growth. Humans, all organisms have a healthy growth phase and cycle in their lives. But if we keep growing beyond that, that's like typically cancer, right? And so it's one thing to think about, like when we see a lot of really relational food businesses getting their start, sometimes people will say to me like, yeah, but that's just so small and it can't possibly can't possibly do the work it needs to do to matter. And it can, because relationality can in fact be scaled, but it can't be giantized, right? So like you can move relational business models and business practices to a certain scale without things becoming totally anonymous. But someone like Josh will get to a place where, like, if he tried to get bigger and bigger, he would lose the things about his business that make it worth doing for him. I don't think Josh is selling coffee because his mission in life is to make a ton of money off of selling coffee. It's because he really, really enjoyed coffee, and he enjoyed roasting it, and he enjoyed being able to share that with his friends and his coworkers, and it grew out of that. And so if we use sort of as a loose kind of guide or metric, like, what is the point at which this can grow? What is the point to which this can grow and still maintain that human scale connection, relationship, and possibility for meaning and pleasure? Then we've got like something that's kind of constraining us from that unlimited growth paradigm. And I think that's really important.
What are some of the things that people like me can do to kind of support my food system or reinvent our food system here?
So the whole book is like a how-to guide for making those choices, right? So in a very simple way, look around you and see what you can change that meets our relational criteria, right? That like you're building a greater relationship with a person, a place, an ecosystem, an animal, right? Where it begins to support people making those changes, right? So and then to live it kind of loudly and audaciously. We talk about Josh so much, Coffee Josh, so much, because I want to like very loudly proclaim this is possible. And I'm sure, based on where you live, that this is in fact something that you can do too, whether it's local farmers, local makers, local bread bakers. Local is not the answer, right? Josh is not local. You can't get coffee locally, but you can
Right.
find the folks that you can actually interact with and find the places where you're doing something that brings you a lot of joy and start to be very, very loud about it. And the second question people ask us immediately is, but what do we do about the people who aren't going to be willing to do this? And our response is maybe someone unusual, ignore them. Like just ignore them. There's going to be a percentage of people who are going to say either like the Eeyores, oh, it's not going to work and I can't do it and it's too hard, right? And then there are going to be the people that are actively opposing you in the change, right? Who do not have your best interest or anybody else's best interest in mind. Ignore them, right? Support the people who are doing the things that you feel meet the criteria for you that is relational, right? And put energy, time, effort. I mean, you're doing it, right? Like have a podcast, talk about it,
Yeah.
share stuff with your friends and make connections to people, places, and things that are not necessarily always 100% comfortable, right? So those connections are really important. And our book for us is a paradigm for that, right? Neither of us could do it alone. It's a little weird and awkward to write a book with somebody and be like, oh, I have this gap in my knowledge and the other person's going to fill it. But it's also super reassuring once you get into it. And so this is how coalition building works everywhere, right? Find the folks like, you talk, I love your podcast and I'm a huge fan. So like, you talk to a certain group of people of whom I'm one, right? And then those people maybe aren't the folks who are going to go listen to a food science podcast, but they may find somebody who does like some part of food science where they're like, that, I love that. Right.
Yeah.
And you can connect in that way. And then that person's like, oh, there's this one guy doing this thing in a basement, cooking this thing. And, you go that too. And you just keep making the connections to people and places and organizations who are doing stuff, even if it's not your stuff. And that kind of coalition building is what we need. It's because the system we're in is very, very isolating and it atomizes us and separates us from each other very purposefully and really successfully. And so the more we fight that atomization by actually building coalition and connection and relationship, the larger our footprint becomes because it's not just us, it's everybody. It's all the folks who care about the things you care about. I'm a vegetarian. 100% under no circumstances going to butcher a chicken. Like,
Yeah.
not going to happen. But the farm I get my vegetables from, if you have a chicken share, they say, hey, why don't you come to butchering day so that we can all understand what's going on here? And lots of people go to learn how to do that and how to do it in a responsible, respectful, and also food, follows all the health and safety codes. But I fully support them in chicken butchering. I love that they do it. I'm never going. right? So those kinds of connections are really important because you support people who are doing things outside of your company.
The one thing I would want to add to that, though, is that, like, for me, as someone who's spent a lot of time really leaning into food justice work and thinking about the differences in positionality and privilege of all of the people who might be listening to this. And, often those of us who are really like come to food for the joy of it and are really interested in that have higher degrees of economic privilege, though not always, right? Like, foodways are such important parts of culture and identity and expression across race and class and so many other forms of identity, and the ways in which we can all participate and the things we're all going to do are going to look a little bit different based on where we live, on what we have to spend on food, and what role we play in the food system. Like I agree with all of the things Michelle said, and I do a lot of those things. And she and I are both really, really concerned, for example, about the plight of food systems workers. And that shows up in another one of the case studies in the book. And so one of the things I'd like to take the opportunity to talk about, because that can feel in some ways the hardest, right? Like, whether you're buying locally or whether you're buying at a grocery store or whether you're shopping at the Costco, once you start to kind of look under the hood on some of this stuff, you realize that, like, oh, there's a lot of other lives, human and otherwise, that are hitched and connected. And so there are things that we can all do aside from our individual food choices to support, for example, people who are pushing for more relational food policy in and around the places you live. And you're in California, Dean, where some years ago I was involved in helping to draft and pass the micro enterprise home kitchen law, which was recently updated. So super cool thing that right now, pretty much only California, maybe Utah have, where people can actually buy and sell food, and more than just kind of like cottage food, baking bread, from their home. They can share their culture and their really delicious food and use it as a way to earn extra income. So you could potentially, instead of going to a chain restaurant, be buying tamales from a woman who's largely home caring for her children and her elders, but making really good food right in your neighborhood. And that's something California now allows. That's a piece of relational food policy that we didn't even get to talk about in the book, that creates additional economic opportunity and chances for us to connect and bump into neighbors that we might not otherwise have as part of our lives. And we can also really think about that when we see people advocating for the rights of farm and food systems workers, and join add our voices to those kinds of protections as well.
The book's been out for a few months now, and you're also doing classes and you're doing talks across the United States. What has been some of the feedback that you've gotten from this? What have people been saying to you about these ideas that you're talking about?
We just wrapped up a week in Colorado, and it was really, really affirming and beautiful to get to interact with so many people. I think there's a thing about this book in that, like, it covers a lot of territory. So there's lots of different parts that people are grabbing onto and wanting to talk about based on how it fits with the way that they interact with food. There's also, like, kind of a big exhale, a breath of something fresh and different in here, because we're not sort of saying vote with your fork, right? Like, this, your power is only as a consumer. We're not simply saying, like, oh, go out and change the world through policy, or you have to do it all yourself in homestead, or you have to look for this or that certification on your product. Like, it's none of those things that everyone's been kind of advocating for over a period of time. And so I think what's been really exciting is that people who've read it so far have said, like, I can in fact move toward relationship. We talk about how perfection is actually sort of a characteristic of white supremacy culture, right? But
Right.
You can also call it a characteristic of sort of like American super individualism and upward mobility culture, right? Not like,
Yeah.
perfectionism is a weird thing, right? And having to act perfect around how we feed ourselves is also a really unattainable standard. And so the idea that there's a spectrum from transactional to relational, and we can be moving toward relationality, seems to feel like a really alluring invitation to a lot of people, particularly because we've provided them with some tools for doing so. And, maybe the most affirming response that we've had so far is that people we really respect, who we see as making pretty big moves toward relationality, have read the book and said, oh, now I don't have to write this. Oh, this felt like a synthesis of what has been on my heart now on the page. And that's been really, really great. But there are lots of questions too. And the questions, I think, are just about as exciting and generative, like, how do we actually put some of this into practice? What would happen if we get more cosmolocal? How would we avoid, as we start doing this, getting things kind of pushed back into their transactionality once you start to do this at larger scale? And those are really exciting questions to start wrestling with.
Michelle, did you want to weigh in on that also?
Yeah, I'm going to answer it slightly differently. We've done talks with a lot of people and a few people. And I think one of the things that I kept saying when people kept asking me, what do you want to have happen with this book? I was like, I just want people to talk to each other. I just want people to talk to each other. And so we've discovered that actually having conversations about this book in small groups is really fun, because people get to talk to each other, not just to us, because once the concepts are clear, you've read the book, you kind of become an expert too, right? That there's no like certificate in relational food systems out there, right? So you've read the book, you're living your life. And I think that part of the really cool thing is seeing people say, but this, oh, what about that? As they talk to each other. And so we're excited, and our website exists and you can go to it and send us an email. But talking to small groups, I've talked to a couple of book clubs who've read the book around the country and said, hey, will you come talk to us? And those are the best conversations, because people are actually, they're digging in, they're like pulling the book out, well, what about this, and reading quotes to each other. I think that those conversations are probably where it's at in terms of talking about this book. You don't want to do it alone, but you also don't want to be in a lecture hall full of people.
So I want to ask you both, now that the book's been out, what's next for you?
Lots of things. I'm going
to let Nicole talk about this one because we're doing it together, but she's the one actually, I'm the one creating the content. She's the one doing the thing. So
one of the things we profile in the set of case studies in chapter 5 is a program that I direct called EcoGather. And it's a collaborative learning network. What the heck does that mean? We make online courses to share information about how we can move toward relationship in food systems, agroecology, but how we can also shape change and how we can create economies that are more focused on well-being across all of those things. But we don't do it from the top down, and we don't do it from the sort of perch of an ivory tower. Instead, we've partnered with organizations, grassroots community-based organizations in India and Bhutan and Denver and Puerto Rico and Vermont, to say that the people who have the expertise are the ones who are actually already living and trying to do this stuff and putting it into practice, and then bringing that knowledge up into EcoGather's courses, and also being in dialogue with each other and saying, like, actually, this is a thing all of us are struggling with, and we're going to need to bring someone who's not in one of those organizations, for example, like Michelle, in to help us build our change competence, to help us become better storytellers, to teach us more about movement history so we can become more effective in our own activism and change shaping. And so I get to lean into that a little bit more in this upcoming year, and we're getting to sort of take what we've built across 350 lessons of content and put it out there in the world and make it more accessible to and usable by all kinds of groups who were not involved in the co-creation of it. And for me, one of the things I'm personally really passionate about as we move into that work is to also think about like what a radical revitalization of rural communities can look like. I think in the US in particular, the ways in which, and I say that because I know this context best, but the ways in which we've urbanized have extracted so much from rural places and rural people. And those are often the places where the food begins from, not exclusively, but most of it starts there. They're also places that can be sites of tremendous experimentation and collaboration and opportunities to really live in seasonal rhythms and with the land. But what we're seeing in some of these places is that they're sort of becoming the second, third, fourth home playgrounds for those who've extracted and accumulated the most, and that they're hollowing out. And so part of what's next for me is really thinking about what relational ethics and practice looks like to do a diverse and vibrant revitalization of rural spaces that honor their history, their traditions, their cultures, but also make them really welcoming sites of belonging for more diverse populations.
I like that. Michelle, how about you?
Well, I'm working with Nicole in EcoGather, and I have a five course set of courses. I don't know what to call it. It could be a certificate program. It could just be fun on change making, coalition building, community building, activism history, all that. So that I'm very much enjoying. We're going to be teaching some classes that happen not just online, but where there's an interactive component to it. And I also have 2 more books lined up that I'm co-writing with people that are food books that I'm super excited about, because I think in both situations, one of them it was in our book, and in both situations, those are places where I get to explore a different aspect of creating food relationships and relationships with food and through food. So I'm super excited.
Sounds wonderful. Michelle and Nicole, I want to thank you for being on the podcast. Feeding Each Other, Shaping Change in Food Systems Through Relationship, Resetting Our Future is available now. You can get it online. We have links in the bio, and you can get it at all better bookstores. Michelle and Nicole, thanks for being on the podcast.
Thanks so
much. Thank you for having this podcast. I love this podcast.
Thank you very much. Thank you. That was my conversation with Michelle Auerbach and Nicole Civita about their book, Feeding Each Other. We have links in the bio to purchase this book, and you can also get it at all better bookstores. We will also include links to their websites and teaching courses. Next week, I'll be speaking with Tammy Donroe-Inman about her books Winter Sweet and the new cookbook, New England Desserts. Until then, I'll see you at the library.